It was a high-profile visit coming at a time of heightened tensions in the Gulf region. The United Arab Emirates says it intercepted a missile fired by Yemen's Houthi rebels as Israel's President Isaac Herzog was on a state visit. UAE media reports said the missile caused no casualties or damage, with its debris falling in unpopulated areas. Sunday's attack follows a series of other missile and drone strikes that Houthi rebels have launched at the UAE in recent weeks. After arriving in Abu Dhabi, Israel's president said his country supports the Gulf state's security needs. Herzog's visit comes just a month and a half after Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett made his landmark trip to the country. Back in December 2020, the UAE, along with Bahrain, Sudan and Morocco, forged diplomatic ties with Israel in a deal brokered by the US. Since then, the UAE and Israel have traded ambassadors and opened direct commercial flights. But those growing ties have come amid growing tensions between Iran and the US over stalled nuclear talks and Tehran's support for Houthi rebels in Yemen's civil war. And to further discuss ties between the UAE and Israel, joining me from Istanbul is Murat Aslan. He is a faculty member at Istanbul Sabahattin Zaim University. And from Hamburg, Sara Bazoobandi. She is a non-resident fellow at the Arab Gulf States Institute. A warm welcome to both. Thank you very much for joining me on Straight Talk. So, Sara, although the president of Israel is more of a ceremonial figure, Herzog's visit to the UAE was still significant as he was the first president to do so. And this visit came just several weeks after Israeli Prime Minister's visit to the UAE. So how far and deep could bilateral relations between the two countries go?
Well, there are definitely some development in the bilateral relations. Although these relations are not completely new, there have been cooperations in the past. But since the Abraham Accord was signed, most of these cooperations have become more visible and more official in a sense. So there is definitely some element of significance to these visits. When one puts all of these into the context of the regional developments, the conflicts in Yemen and the repercussions for the wider GCC region and specifically for the UAE, the drone attacks and all of those very fastly unwrapping developments, it is indeed signaling an important development and willingness between both sides to further collaboration and cooperations on every front, not only economic and development.
So, Murat, what's your take on that? I mean, how have these ties evolved since the signing of the Abraham Accords? And do you think these two countries have managed to overcome their differences somehow?
Well, you know, it's not new because UAE and Israel does have relations for a decade, and I think that they have now mutual economic investments in both countries. For instance, UAE had bought a share of a company operating in energy sector, and they were planning to transfer the gas to, Gulf countries and Far East by means of cooperation of both. So in terms of economics, yes, I mean, they advanced that. On the other hand, we have to think security because both countries' cooperation means Israel will be more involved in providing security in terms of, defense procurements or air defense systems that Israel may export to the region. And then it may be a type of party, maybe, to the conflict in Yemen indirectly. So, Sara, it seems both sides have moved towards putting aside their differences and focus on economic relations. So will these relations exclusively be limited to economic ties, or they could grow into a security partnership or further military cooperation?
Well, there definitely is some tendency in the Gulf to find security partners, especially in the light of the supposed or assumed U.S. lack of interest in as the traditional security provider for the region. So it's a natural instinct for the region, for the GCC, to seek security allies across the region. And also, one needs to put again into perspective that whilst these visits are happening, at the same time, a trade delegation is planned to visit from Tehran to the UAE. So they are playing both sides and they're assessing all the options. Again, putting into context, Qatar was recently, there are some discussions. I'm not even quite sure that actually it has been finalized yet or not, but there are some discussions that the US is planning to nominate Qatar as a major non-NATO ally.
Yes,
so
it has
putting
already.
all of this into perspective, it has already, thank you very much. So putting all of this to perspective, it shows that the region is changing and the powers across the region are seeking new alliances. So it is not surprisingly if we see in the near future that the relationships between Israel and the UAE, for example, evolve into security or military dynamics. But at the moment, I don't have enough evidence to really confirm that, whether this is correct or not.
So, Murat, what kind of ramification will normalized relations between the UAE and Israel have on the region, and how would that affect the UAE's already fragile relations with Iran?
Well, cooperation is mostly does not have only one dimension, but many strengths of cooperation. Well, first, let me remind you one thing. This area is commonly known as truce states. The states in this region is commonly known as truce states. That means there has always been conflict among the states in this region. And if Israel, the United States, or any other country, just presents their military bases in the region, that means there are some countries consuming security by means of this force, or sometimes they are providing, that means exporting security. And there must be a common threat. In this case, Iran seems to be like a hammer at the north of the Gulf region. That means they have to check and balance it. And in the meantime, they have to compete among themselves. So Israel now, one of the actors that directly engages with one of the security consumer as security provider by means of selling weapons, maybe defense procurements.
Yes.
Then, yes.
So, Sara, Israeli President Herzog has said he's hopeful that other regional countries will join the Abraham Accords. Do you think others will follow this path to normalizing relations with Israel? And if they do so, would that mean a more isolated Iran?
Jordan and Egypt had for several decades peace treaty with Israel. I think the Arab nations that they're specifically focusing on and talking about are the GCCs. And in the GCC, the only major country that hasn't really joined the Abraham Accord is Saudi Arabia. So as and when Saudi Arabian leadership is ready to join in, or the public in Saudi Arabia is ready to accept such move by their leadership, I'm not really sure when that would be, at which point in time would that be. But definitely normalization of relationships between Israel and any other countries across the region would go against the traditional political narrative of anti-Israeli that has come out of Tehran for the past 4 decades. So it is indeed going to have repercussions for Iran, and it is indeed going to have an impact on balance of power. But I don't really have a crystal ball to put a timeline on it to say when exactly this is going to happen, or anytime soon, whether it's going to happen or not.
So, Murat, if these GCC countries normalize relations with Israel, how would that impact the Iran's nuclear talks as well as the situation in Yemen?
Well, Israel will be much more closer to Iranian borders by means of their footprint, like politics, like economics. So, well, they may be exposed to Iranian threats in case there's an escalation in the region. Or in the meantime, they may also directly engage with Iran by having some privileges in the countries in the region. On the other hand, we must remember something. Iran has the longest coast across the Gulf region. That means Iran cannot be pacified by means of Israeli presence in the region. On the other hand, it will have impact. That means Israel may provoke the states in the region. On the other hand, Iran will counter it in terms of providing additional support to the opposing elements, like the Shiites in Bahrain or the Houthis in Yemen, etc.
So, Sara, has the U.S.'s partial withdrawal from the Middle East pushed regional countries to realign themselves? And could they overcome their differences so as to make this region relatively stable?
Answering the final part of your question, I should say, unfortunately, not, because realignments at the moment and the structure that I see doesn't really signal further stability. It's unless one of the key partners in this equivalent is going to make major compromises. But definitely the supposed withdrawal, which I personally don't believe that there is a full-scale withdrawal of the U.S. from the region. I must rest my case there. But this assumed withdrawal of the U.S. has indeed have had repercussions for the wider regional alliance structure, not only across the region, but also opening up spaces for other outsiders such as Russia and China. So yes, there has been some reshuffling of alliance. There has been some changes in the security structure and the security mentality and the security strategy across the region. But whether or not this is leading to a longer-term, stable regional dynamics, I remain, unfortunately, a little bit pessimistic.
So let's not get too hopeful about it, right? So Sara, Murat, unfortunately, we'll have to leave it here. Thank you very much for joining me on Straight Talk.